Well, hi, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for attending our first inaugural lecture, architectural lecture presented by the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation. Our guest tonight, our guest speaker is Michael Hodges, longtime writer for the Detroit News and the author of the biography Building the Modern World, Albert Kahn in Detroit. Before we get to Michael, I'd like to introduce Heidi Fanis, Legacy Foundation, our presenter, our sponsor tonight. And Heidi, why don't you take it away and tell us a little bit about the foundation?
All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to all of you today. We are very excited to have you join us. This is a big deal. This is our first event of many that will be coming. We have a lot of very interesting things coming up. So the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation was founded last year when everybody was at home trying to figure out what to do with themselves. We were getting busy and having lots of meetings. So we organized last year, and we have been in this year-long launch of doing all the things that makes this organization happen. We're a 501c3, so we're a nonprofit. Tonight we have so many people joining us. We have family members of the Albert Kahn family, and it's not just Albert's children, but all his cousins and siblings and all of their families. So we're very excited to have you join us. We have a lot of people from the Jewish community. We're very thrilled to have you. We have people who have worked for Albert Kahn or do work for Albert Kahn. The people that used to work for Albert Kahn over all the years have a very fond name called ex-cons. So we have lots of ex-cons with us tonight. We have building owners and clients and historians and architects and engineers and just lots of people of all different backgrounds. So we're very thrilled to have you here. Welcome. Before we introduce Michael Hodges, we want to let you know some of the things that are coming up before long. So in June, we have Michael Smith talking about Albert and Julius Kahn and the invention of the modern factory. That will be also a free webinar. In September, John Gallagher is going to look at the influence of Albert Kahn and other architects as he talks about the emergence of Yamasaki. In November, we're looking for Jeff Morrison from Guardians of Detroit. We're also planning a bicycle tour and some walking tours for fall. And also in October, an annual membership meeting. So in order to come to that one, we need you to join and be members. And so that will be an exclusive member event where we will also be having a virtual tour. So you can still call in from Spain and participate in the annual meeting. So we just really are excited to have you here. Please visit the albertkahnlegacy.org website. You can register for the upcoming events. There, you can also join up for membership, for sponsorship, for volunteering opportunities. We're just really excited. We've got a lot of things coming, and we're looking forward to having you be part of our Legacy Foundation. So thank you, and back to John.
Thank you, Heidi. Well, again, welcome everybody. We're happy you can be here this evening for the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation's first in a series of architectural lectures that we'll be presenting. Our guest tonight is Michael Hodges. You may know him as the fine arts writer for the Detroit News, where he worked for more than 30 years. Michael's book, Building the Modern World, Albert Kahn in Detroit, is the second book on local architecture and was honored by the Michigan chapter of the American Institute of Architects with its Balthazar Korab Award in 2018. Michael's previous book was Michigan's Historic Railroad Stations, also published by Wayne State Press, and both of his books were named Michigan Notable Books by the Library of Michigan. Michael credits his architectural interest on growing up in a picturesque Rochester Hills dairy farm and also being a student for several years at Cranbrook. So one housekeeping thing, after Michael's presentation, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. If you notice on the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A icon. You can type your questions in there, and we'll be fielding those and presenting them to Michael after his presentation. So Michael, on to you. Thank you and welcome.
Very good. Let me try to share screen here and see if we can get going. So has Albert Kahn come up?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for turning out on what, at least in Southeast Michigan, and I presume Chicago, is a beautiful evening. I am, as advertised, Michael Hodges, formerly of the Detroit News. I just retired in January. Thank you very much. It's delightful, although I did have a great job. I'm going to give sort of a quick overview of Albert Kahn, his personal history, and why he matters in architectural history. I'm trying to contain this to about 45 minutes. I used to be a school teacher. Former students of mine will tell you if you ask that I can speak for hours and hours, but I'm going to try to keep it to an appropriate length tonight. As noted, my previous book, just for fun, was, hold on just a second. John, I'm having trouble advancing my screen. Let's see. Oh, poo.
All right. Can you go to
Wait,
the slide?
maybe. There. Sorry, I was hitting the wrong thing. This is my former book, which came out in 2012. And I show it not only to boost sales, but also to underline the reason that I do books on local architecture is so I can take the pictures. So this was a loving look at Michigan's coolest, oldest stations, whereas obviously Albert Kahn was a more significant enterprise, a real sort of gutsy biography, which took 3 or 4 years for both photography and research and writing. And I have to admit was an immense amount of fun. So Albert Kahn has begun to rise in reputation again. It's a long overdue rise, in my opinion. Interestingly enough, Albert Kahn, when he died in 1942, probably of congestive heart failure, had there been CPAP machines, he might have lived quite a bit longer. He was easily one of the most famous architects on planet Earth, every bit as famous as that show-off and self-promoter Frank Lloyd Wright, whose reputation has only increased in the decades since his death. Whereas in many respects, Albert Kahn vanished, particularly outside of Southeast Michigan, which was one of the issues that piqued my curiosity in taking on this project. And I have a couple of theories about that we will hit in a moment. I wanted to thank right off the bat the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation for asking me to speak. It was a great honor, and I'm delighted with their creation. I also always try to thank Albert Kahn Associates, the successor firm, which was enormously helpful and enthusiastic about my project, and among other things, gave me access to all their historic photos without charge. Any of you who've ever published picture books will know that getting rights to other people's pictures frequently involves large sums of money. So it was a very kind gesture on their part. The Kahn family has also been just wonderful to this outsider barging into their family history. In particular, Carol Rose Kahn outside Ann Arbor was an immense source of encouragement and information. But I dealt with a number of relatives whom I'd like to name quickly. Albert Butzel was tremendously helpful in getting me the rights to some family photographs. And I also spoke at various lengths with Sally Robinson, Ellen Kahn, Betsy Lendorf, Susie Farbman, and Ann Taubes. In fact, the latter two invited me to a Kahn family cocktail party in New York City the year that my book came out, and that was really one of the high points of my social career over the past 10 years. So getting back to Albert, if you wanted to overstate things and summarize his importance, and I concede that there's a bit of overstatement here, but there's also a large degree of truth, you could say that the story of Albert Kahn is the story of a penniless German Jewish immigrant who played a huge role in inventing what we consider modern architecture. Played also a completely overlooked role, possibly in saving the Diego Rivera Detroit industry murals at the Detroit Institute of Arts, something which had been completely forgotten by history. And he also went a long ways towards guaranteeing victory to the Allies in World War II. I always like to say it's not a bad day's work if you can get it. I'm going to touch on his connections to modern architecture and also his role in World War II. I am not, for time reasons, going to go into how he managed to play a role in saving the Diego Rivera murals when they were under a conservative religious attack in 1933. You'll forgive the author, you'll have to buy the book to see that story, but it's an interesting one. So, the Kahn family came over from Germany on the French steamer, the SS Saint Laurent, in 1881. It's remarkable, by the way, what you can find on the internet these days. The passage over took about 2 weeks. And Albert, as his sister Molly Kahn-Fuchs pointed out many years later, played a key role because he was the only member of the family who spoke any English, which was useful both, I think, on the steamer as well as obviously when they landed in the United States. The Kahns were from Ronen, Germany, outside of Frankfurt, a town small enough that I have yet to meet a German who's actually heard of it. But when they moved to the United States, they had been living in Luxembourg with an aunt, as I understand it, for a number of years, which I think had as much to do with economics as anything. The Kahns were cultured people, but they were not wealthy people at all. In fact, Molly Kahn-Fuchs, one of Albert's two sisters, noted in a short memoir written towards the end of her life that when they arrived in the United States, she said they were, quote, none too flourishing financially, which I thought was kind of a lovely way of summing it up. By the way, almost every printed account of Albert Kahn's arrival in the United States will say that he arrived in 1880. But I was able, again, through the miracle of the internet, to pull up his actual handwritten application for a US passport when he was in his late teens or early 20s. And in that, in his angular kind of jagged handwriting, he says quite clearly that my family arrived in the United States in 1881, and that is when my life in Detroit began. It's interesting to note that when he arrived in 1881, he was about 12 years old. Albert Kahn never attended another day of school thereafter. He went to work immediately. He numbers among the last generation of American architects who did not get formal academic training, but learned their entire craft by working largely as apprentices in architecture firms. So when he arrives in the United States, he, through rather good luck, manages to score an apprenticeship with the John L. Scott Company, a distinguished local architecture firm, which for the Detroiters here, built the old Wayne County Courthouse on Campus Martius in downtown Detroit, as well as most of the grand homes on East Ferry, just north of the Detroit Institute of Arts, right off Woodward, most of which now comprise the rather elegant boutique hotel, the Inn on Ferry Street. At John L. Scott, the young Kahn, who again is about 12 or 13, was given only kind of gutter tasks to do. He emptied waste baskets, he ran errands, and interestingly, he ground ink. Who knew you used to have to grind ink? But apparently that was part of his responsibilities. However, the young Kahn also had an earlier obligation every morning, rubbing down 2 horses. He would then sprint to the Scott firm on Fort Street in Detroit. And basically he showed up stinking of the stable. Bear in mind, he's a very poor kid. His family has very little in the way of resources. Their early years were difficult years in Detroit. So he didn't exactly have a ton of extra clothing that he could slap on quickly. And he gets fired. And as he put it in 1926, when he's a successful architect, he said that his smell literally got on the Scott firm's olfactory nerves. And not only did they fire the young boy, which seems a little cruel, but they, according to Albert, in retrospect, they tossed him out with insult and abuse. Allegedly, this is his recollection, he lacks vision and initiative, and he'll never amount to a hill of beans, which is interesting given what he goes on to become, and also that he goes on to become one of the world's famous workaholic architects. In subsequent decades, when he appears in feature stories around the world, there was hardly a single one that didn't mention his habit, if he were to work late into the night at the office, of curling up on a drafting table for a nap. So he gets fired, and this is tragic and must have been awful for his parents, who probably thought they had launched their oldest child on the road to the American middle class. But good luck intervenes, and he quickly gets hired by another firm, Mason and Rice. And here things were quite different. For those of you with a local orientation, Mason and Rice are responsible for Detroit's Masonic Temple, the adorable stick-style, shingle-style train depot in Chelsea, Michigan, west of Ann Arbor, and also the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island. And there's some indication that Albert Kahn, as a young apprentice, may have been responsible for the design of the famous front porch that you have to pay $10 to walk up onto unless you are a hotel guest. Albert's comment was, he said, in the Mason and Rice office, I found fair and kindly treatment, for that was Mr. Mason's strong point. Indeed, George Mason, who was about, I think, 12 years older than Kahn, used to often bring him home to his house at night, where Albert would eat with Mr. and Mrs. Mason, and then work on drawings and projects afterwards. But when their work was all done, he said George Mason would often pull out his collection of photographs and drawings and would point out the good from the bad. And Albert often said that that was about 50% of the education that he got in architecture, was from those late evening discussions. In 1890, by which point Kahn has been at Mason and Rice for 7 or 8 years probably, he wins a traveling fellowship from American Architect and Building News, which was a significant national magazine. He won $500, and it was supposed to carry him through an entire tour of Europe for 1 year, where he would do nothing but sketch. We will come back to that briefly, but let me just advance so we can show you what, hopefully you can see this, and that I'm hoping that Albert on the far right is not blocked by the little boxes enumerating speakers here. In any event, this is the Kahn family circa late 1880s. Albert is on the right. If you can't see him, he's dapper and has a mustache and a confident look in his eyes. On the left is his brother Julius, who also goes on to be significant in Albert's career. And at the bottom, next to his father's knee, is little Louis, who was my high school friend Robbie Kahn's grandfather, which I was delighted to discover. And this is Albert Kahn on the left, obviously. at Mason and Rice in their offices circa 1889, 1890. So Albert goes to Europe for a year. Mason and Rice very kindly let him take a full year leave of absence. They were very excited for him. And he tours Europe. In Italy, in Florence, he bumps into another young architect, much better educated in formal terms, much, much, much wealthier, by the name of Henry Bacon. And the two end up traveling together for 3 or 4 months. Henry Bacon goes on a number of years later to design and build the Lincoln Memorial. So it's an interesting intersection of two architects who go on to be world famous in their respective spheres and ended up allegedly remaining friends, though I was never able to find any correspondence between them, which was a disappointment to me. Albert Kahn always said that Henry Bacon was responsible for the other 50% of his architectural education that he did not get from George Mason. Albert comes back in 1891. They are thrilled to have him back. He produced an astonishing array of drawings, most of which are at the University of Michigan Museum of Art, though they're not exhibited very often because they're fragile. But he was a remarkably gifted freehand artist. You would have thought he'd gone to some, platinum plated art school. So this, by the way, we're leaping a little ahead in time, but this is Albert and Ernestine, his wife, in Venice, circa 1912. Ernestine, by the way, was a remarkable individual in her own right and with a considerable backbone. She had to have it because Albert, although he was a doting father and husband, was also a complete workaholic, and work always took precedence, something that Ernestine had to learn to manage through their marriage. One of the very first large commissions that Kahn gets in Detroit is to build the conservatory on Belle Isle, Detroit's Island Park in the Detroit River. He also built the aquarium, which the conservatory is attached to. The conservatory has since been lavishly renovated, but at the time I took these photographs, I loved the fact that the 2 little windows are missing in that turret on the left. I always say to people, that's what makes this a photograph. And in 1903, he builds the engineering building at the University of Michigan, now the West Engineering Building, with its famous arch, which connects to the outside of the campus. I've always liked to say that even though the engineering building is not in of itself a brilliant building, it's a very capable, well-built building, very typical of Albert Kahn. But it is in many respects what I like to call an iconic building precisely because of this arch. I like to say you could take any 100-year-old University of Michigan graduate on her deathbed, God bless her, demented as can be, and she will probably remember the engineering arch. It's one of those little architectural experiences that unconsciously sort of weighs on us in ways that we don't always recognize. The engineering building is one of the first buildings he works on with his brother Julius. Julius in 1903 gets a patent for a reinforced concrete system, which becomes known as the Kahn system of reinforced concrete. You sometimes hear Detroiters say that the Kahn brothers invented reinforced concrete. That's nonsense. There were French engineers working on it in the early 1800s. But it's nonetheless, even though there were many other types of reinforced concrete or systems, the Kahn system was relatively economical in comparison to others, easy to pull off. Reinforced concrete, for those like me who didn't know at one point, is concrete that has steel members embedded in it before the concrete hardens. So the steel dramatically increases the strength of the concrete. And this leads to a number of really significant advantages. One, it's much, much stronger than previous slow burning masonry construction, which is what most previous factories in particular had been made out of. I love that characterization, slow burning. That's just got to give you confidence. Because of its much greater physical strength, reinforced concrete is capable of much wider window spans. And on the insides of factories, you need far fewer columns to hold up the stories above you. So it opens things up. And at a stroke, Albert and Julius Kahn create what became known as the Daylight Factory with its huge windows. And the exemplar of that is the building number 10 at the Packard Motor Car Factory out on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit, which went up in 1905. This is a completely reinforced concrete factory. It's built with Julius's system, which, by the way, they helped test in the basement of Albert and Julius's parents' house in Detroit. This building, you could knock out everything in the building here that you see, all the windows, the brickwork beneath them. The only thing holding this building up are the white elements, the floor slabs and the vertical columns. So really, this building is a reinforced concrete shell that then gets filled in with windows, et cetera. What's interesting in terms of modern architecture is the resemblance this bears to contemporary buildings, which are mostly glass. The amount of glass in Packard number 10 would have staggered contemporary observers. One of the few things you could really compare it to would be Gothic cathedrals with their walls of stained glass, but we know they only stand up because of the flying buttresses, the props, which hold up the weakened walls. Because in buildings where every inch of the building helps hold up all the inches above it and all the stories above it, the more glass you put in, the more window space, the weaker that wall becomes. That's not true with reinforced concrete, nor would it be true with steel buildings, which then replaced reinforced concrete at a later date. So building number 10, Packard building number 10 is a revolutionary building. And in many respects, it is Julius's input with reinforced concrete that helps revolutionize Kahn's practice, which had been kind of floundering. Right around the turn of the century, he was known in many respects as a house builder and a builder of additions to elegant houses in Grosse Pointe and Indian Village and the Boston Edison Historic District. But the use of Julius's reinforced concrete system completely upends Kahn's career. This, by the way, just for interest's sake, is the Packard Plant. Not today. This is about 10 years ago when I caught it on a particularly beautiful day with snow. And I did something very sensible when I was writing this book. I rented a helicopter for 1 hour at sunset in the middle of August and went up and took aerial pictures of the Packard Plant and its devastation, as well as the news center, which we'll see in a minute. So Packard number 10 is important for a number of reasons, not least that it appears to have caught the attention of Henry Ford. And so by 1908, the Detroit Free Press runs a short little piece about architect Albert Kahn was working with a car maker to design a new car factory that would be built out in Highland Park. Clearly, the Ford Highland Park plant, which is where most of the early, well, all the early Model Ts were built. This is what's left. The building on the right is the old administration and sales building. It's a little more decorated than the rest of the complex was. The building on the left resembles the original factory building, which went up in 1910. tragically, that's been torn down, but we do have this annex on the left, which gives you a good visual sense of what the original building looked like. It was mostly glass by comparison to the building standards of the day, and very functional and unornamented, again, by the standards of the day. And this is where the tie-in to modern architecture comes, because this building opens in 1910, and young architectural rebels in Europe who were looking for a radical new system and approach to architecture apparently were aware of Albert Kahn's auto factories in Detroit and seized on them. And one such radical, Walter Gropius, who of course becomes one of the fathers of modern architecture, he noted in a 1913 article in a German architectural journal, quote, that the newest halls of the great North American trusts can almost bear comparison with the work of the ancient Egyptians in their overwhelming monumental power. And he was referring to a lot of things, but in large part, he was referring to Highland Park. And allegedly, according to Rayner Bonham, a distinguished British architectural historian, Walter Gropius had a picture of Highland Park above his drafting table in 1911 when he was designing, this building, which is the Fagerswerk plant in Hanover, Germany, or near Hanover, Germany. This does not look like building number 10, but it is based very much on it. It is a reinforced concrete building with maximum window space. And it is considered a revolutionary accomplishment in modern European design. In fact, this building is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but the Highland Park plant, which was the inspiration in many respects for Gropius's approach to this, is not. It is mostly abandoned. Certain parts of it are rented out for storage space, and an awful lot of the original Highland Park plant got replaced by a large strip mall on Woodward Avenue, which I think is kind of a tragedy. Walter Gropius was not the only architect, by the way, who seized on Kahn's auto factories. Le Corbusier, the great French modernist architect, also included a picture of the Highland Park plant, the very first picture, in his 1921 classic Vers une architecture, towards an architecture. So Kahn appears to have had this like sort of uncanny influence on European architects who were disgusted with what they regarded as the banal, hideously over-ornamented traditions of European architecture. Now, had Albert Kahn built skyscrapers utilizing his approach to factories, what he called the factory style, what others called the machine style, he would probably be heralded as one of the founders of architectural modernism and the international style, as we've come to call much of it. But even though Albert Kahn regarded his factories as beautiful, and that's the term he used, he felt that the factory style was inappropriate for anything but factories and warehouses. And I think this has a lot to do with why he has disappeared from architectural history, or at least from the canon. Not only that, although Kahn was really a very gracious man, he could be a bit peppery, and he had some rather sharp comments on Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier and other European modernist architects who were putting up these rectilinear buildings, these houses with flat roofs, etc., and in Kahn's term, windows in funny places in the 1920s. And Kahn was fairly clear that he felt that these were absurd buildings. The way this boomeranged on him is that by attacking architectural modernists in the 1920s for bad taste or mediocrity, after 1945, once Kahn dies, everyone in the United States who was an architect or a curator or an architectural librarian They were all architectural modernists. And I think that the profession took a little revenge on this old man who had the temerity to insult the brave new style that overtook architecture. Now, Le Corbusier wasn't, or rather, Walter Gropius wasn't the only person who seized on the Highland Park plant. So too did Giacomo Agnelli, the founder of Fiat Motors. And in about 1920, he has this plant built in Turin, Italy, which is in the upper left-hand corner of Italy and is the auto capital of Italy. And this was the Fiat Lingotto plant that ran until the 1930s sometimes. Now, it doesn't look like Highland Park, I'll grant you, but that's mostly because it's concrete-faced and not brick-faced. However, Agnelli told his engineer, Giacomo Mattetrucco, basically, copy what Albert Kahn did in Detroit. And that's what Mattetrucco did in the late 1920s. Interestingly enough, in the late 19 teens, because this plant opens in the early 20s. Interestingly, Henry Ford, by about 1914 or 15, had already decided that Highland Park, which this is based on, was obsolete. And his reasons for that is that he realized quite quickly after introducing the moving assembly line in Highland Park 3 years after the factory was built in 1913, he realized that multi-story construction works against the efficiencies of the moving assembly line. And so from 1915 on, Henry Ford is looking for a vast tract of land, which he finds on the Rouge River, just south of Detroit, where he builds the Ford Rouge complex, where Albert Kahn builds the Ford Rouge complex, where virtually every building, no matter how tall it looks, was single story, so that the entire complex could be connected by one moving assembly line, one pumping circulatory system. Back to Fiat Lingotto momentarily, in a charming note, the way that this plant handled car construction was the exact opposite of what Henry Ford did with Highland Park. At Highland Park, Henry Ford brought everything up onto the ceiling, all the little bits he bought from other car makers and production people, and the little pieces would land on the roof, and then they would get assembled and slide down gravity chutes and get put into bigger assemblages and slide down another chute until the car would get popped out on the second floor and the chassis would be dropped on it, or the body would be dropped on it. Henry Ford claimed that top-down system saved energy. I don't quite understand it, but he was a genius, and I'm surely not. Here at Fiat Lingotto, Agnelli did the obvious thing. They brought in the little bits on the ground floor and put them together, and the cars would rise through the building on elevators until, finished, at the very top, they popped out and there was a racetrack on top of the building, and they would zip around the racetrack, which I have to say, I find both charming, adorable, and almost heartbreakingly Italian at some level that I find hard to describe. I've been, by the way, to the Fiat Lingotto factory. Unlike Highland Park, it is now a luxury shopping mall with all sorts of stores I couldn't afford. There's an art gallery on top of the Fiat Lingotto plant, shopping mall, that contains the Agnelli family art collection, which is small but spectacular. So if you pay $14 or so, you can actually take an elevator to the top, go through this marvelous little art gallery, and then you can walk around this racetrack, which still stands there. I want to point out there are a couple of other architects who also tie Albert Kahn to the creation of modern architecture as we know it. One is Mies van der Rohe, the great modernist who worked mostly in Chicago, but built Lafayette Towers and Lafayette Park in Detroit, the residential complex. And also Eero Saarinen, who built the General Motors Tech Center and the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. Both of them pegged the beginning of architectural modernism with Albert Kahn's Highland Park plant. I'm going to run through a few of his factories because those are really what's important about Albert Kahn in architectural history. And then we'll look at some of his work in Detroit and hopefully get out of here before sunset. So this is the 1922-23 glass plant at the Ford Rouge complex, which interests me in part because even today it looks, I think, staggeringly modern, even to contemporary eyes. And was another sort of landmark design that was imitated around the world. The funny roof line, of course, is designed so that the windows which line the funny roof line can open up and vent the tremendous heat generated in the glassmaking process. One of the differences with the Rouge complex compared to Highland Park is Henry Ford had decided with the Rouge, he didn't want to buy a damn thing from any other car maker. He wanted to make it all himself, including millions and millions and millions of square feet of automobile glass produced in this plant. We're jumping ahead to the late 30s here. This is the Chrysler or Dodge, it goes by both names, half-ton truck plant in Warren, Michigan, just north of Detroit. What I like about this building is you can sort of see where modern architecture was going. It's all windows for very practical reasons, of course. But by this point, reinforced concrete has been replaced by steel. Steel manufacturing methods improved dramatically in the 20s. And because auto construction was no longer being carried out in 5-story buildings where rigidity was really important. You didn't want the damn building to shake when you were rolling a couple of tons across the 5th floor. You don't need that sort of rigidity in single-story buildings. So steel pretty much eclipses concrete by the mid-20s or a little later. To me, I just think this building is astonishingly crisp, and it strikes me like an industrial cathedral. Forgive me if I already said that. Tragically, my understanding is that this building still stands, but has been added onto in all directions, so it's unrecognizable today, which I think is a loss for all of us. This is the circa 1940 Chrysler tank arsenal. Again, just notice all the glass in this steel construction building and the tremendous amount of light pouring in. European modernists, although they worshipped Albert Kahn's industrial work, were contemptuous of his non-industrial work. So here we have a good example. On the left is the Detroit Trust Company on Fort Street in downtown Detroit, right across from where my office used to be. And it is what European modernists would call, with a little condescension, a backward-looking building, a historical pastiche, where the steel frame inside is completely disguised by bric-a-brac, which has been attached to the outside. The architecture that Albert Kahn unintentionally led to, of course, is visible in the building on the right, a 1970s skyscraper, 211 West 4th Street, where you go to get a quickie US passport in downtown Detroit if you need one, which is all about basically windows and transparency. And it all stems once again from building number 10 and its tremendous use of window space. Perhaps in Detroit, the apotheosis of this is Lafayette Towers, the Mies van der Rohe residential buildings. I like to think if we brought Albert Kahn back, despite his contempt for 1920s modernism, some of which was kind of funny looking and experimental, I like to think that in the endless repetition of these window frames, that he would see something elegant and beautiful. I'm probably wrong on that, but I cling to that. I still think that it would be hard not to recognize that. By the way, Mies van der Rohe said for his inspiration, he used to go around to the back of Kahn's factories because there you really saw the crude, unornamented, very plain design. Kahn, by the way, was famous for saving his clients money, not showing off. And this was his principal charge with Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier, that they were showing off at their client's expense without really adding value. And Kahn also had a reputation for bringing projects in not only under cost, but early. So let's now go into Detroit briefly, just for a quick tour of some of his significant Detroit buildings. This is the 1920 General Motors building going up on Grand Boulevard. My father, who was born, who would have been 7 when this building opened, lived about 2 blocks away at Pallister and 3rd and remembered riding his bike past this construction site. When it opened, the GM building was the 2nd largest contemporary building on planet Earth, outstripped only by the Equitable building in New York City. The World War I flying ace Eddie Rickenbacker, by the way, swore that he could land a biplane on the General Motors building roof. I don't know if he ever attempted that, but it would have been interesting to see if he had. Probably Kahn's best known work in Detroit is the 1928-29 Art Deco Fischer building. You can tell it's Art Deco, of course, because of all those repetitive vertical lines. The Fischer building anchors the new center, which is the city that Kahn built in Midtown Detroit. And right across the street on the bottom left, you can see the top of the General Motors building. Art Deco structures, of course, frequently are ornamented with decorative stuff. And you don't really see this with the Fischer building unless you have a nifty telephoto lens, but there are all these faces, gargoyle faces at the top, which I was delighted to discover. The interior of the Fischer building is beautiful and dramatic. In particular, its barrel vaulted ceilings, which were designed by Geza Marotti, a Hungarian architect who came and did a lot of work for Kahn and Eliel Saarinen at Cranbrook, and who ended up doing an awful lot of architectural ornamentation rather than out and out building construction. By the way, the Fischer building ceilings were meticulously cleaned by a high-tech firm from Cambridge, Massachusetts, a couple of years ago. The building is now owned by The Platform, which is a development group in Detroit that has poured a great deal of money into the building. If you haven't been in the Fischer building in a couple years, the ceilings have never looked better in our lifetimes. Some of you may know that originally the Fischer building was meant to be a gargantuan complex with millions and millions of square feet. The only part that got built is the bit on the right, one of the small bookends that were to frame a 60-odd story central structure. This obviously was an early iteration of the complex, so you can tell that the top is not designed as a mansard roof, which would be the ultimate design. So clearly this is an earlier iteration. Why didn't this tremendous complex get built? The stock market crash. And the Fischer brothers, who had just sold their enterprise to General Motors for billions of dollars, that's where we get Body by Fischer, they decided it was foolish to build millions upon millions of square feet of new office space in the midst of a depression, which was probably sensible. Albert Kahn also built much of what we consider the old part of the University of Michigan, a fact not particularly well known among University of Michigan students. One of his, after the engineering building in 1903, his next really significant commission is Hill Auditorium, which is a great stage and performance space. This goes up in about 1912. I'm particularly fond of it because it reminds me of Louis Sullivan, the great Chicago architect, and in particular, some of his jewel box bank designs in small towns in the upper Midwest. Google Sullivan jewel box banks, and you will be astonished at some of what comes up. Here, what I particularly like is this brick facade that has this stone inset, like sort of punctured into the brick facade. And looming up above the whole thing, of course, is a Burton Memorial Tower, which is also an Albert Kahn design from the 1930s. He also, in the mid-20s, designs what was the General Library, now the Graduate Library. And again, you can see echoes of Packard Building number 10 in the tremendous window space. By the way, in the early 20s, there was a revolt of certain snooty faculty and snooty alumni at the University of Michigan who claimed that who claimed that buildings at the university too often looked like factories. This building wasn't up yet, but Natural Sciences was at the time of this flap. And the complaint was basically that these buildings look like what Albert Kahn designs factories out of. And that was not felt to rise to the dignity necessary at a great land grant institution. Burton Memorial Tower, which Kahn builds in 1936, based on an earlier and somewhat more elegant and fluted design by Eliel Saarinen, Eero's father, who built my high school, Cranbrook, in Bloomfield Hills. The ultimate, Saarinen had done a design for a music quadrangle in the early 20s. It does not get built. Part of it was a Carillon bell tower. Kahn took that bell tower design and then made it his own, which is something he loved doing, taking another architect's example and then molding it into his own work. And the result here is that we have a much squatter, more, you'll forgive the gender-based description, masculine design that dominates the entire center of Ann Arbor, a bit like the World Trade Towers used to dominate lower Manhattan. Kahn also designed at the university the Clements Memorial Library, which houses a collection of rare Americana. This entire building and complex has since been renovated, so the brick court now looks like $1 million. And he designs in 1915 the Detroit Athletic Club, the DAC, in downtown Detroit, which is, you know, kind of, again, European modernists would call this a backward-looking building, but is based on sort of images from Florence and whatnot of Renaissance palaces. It is a Renaissance palazzo. About 3 blocks away is another Renaissance palazzo with rather different surface treatment, which went up about 10 years after the DAC. It's the old Detroit Police Headquarters. There is an apocryphal tale running around, especially among a lot of the young kids who've moved into Detroit in recent years and have gotten like just totally enthusiastic about the city's history and its architectural legacy. And the story has been put out that Albert Kahn designed the police headquarters to look like the DAC to insult those anti-Semitic snoots at the DAC who didn't let Jews join the club. The DAC, by the way, offered Albert an honorary membership when the building was completed, which he graciously declined. There doesn't appear to be any basis for this, however. The buildings look rather different to the layperson. And in any case, I don't think Albert Kahn, the most practical of all possible architects, the guy who said that architecture is 90% business and 10% art, he was not going to risk offending his clients, dozens of whom, and maybe more, were members at the DAC. So it's a nice story. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be true. Rather, what it illustrates is that Kahn frequently reused the general outline of an already built building for a new building. And in fact, Claire Zimmerman, a professor at the University of Michigan, has done a lot of work documenting how Kahn kind of helps create a mass production system for architectural design. Albert Kahn built both of the standing temples Bethel in the city of Detroit, both the one that became the Bonstell Theater in the center of the city, and also the 1925, I believe, Temple Bethel in Highland Park, which, for those of you not from Detroit, is a little municipality entirely surrounded by the city of Detroit. If you think this bears some resemblance to the Lincoln Memorial by Henry Bacon, you might be right. Again, taking another man's inspiration and making it Albert Kahn's own. This is the great chandelier inside Temple Bethel. By the way, I went to Mark Schatz's bar mitzvah in 1968 in Temple Bethel before the congregation moved out to Bloomfield Hills, and I was dazzled. And in 1915, he builds the Detroit News Building, which is still standing, though no longer inhabited by the newspaper. There are publishing grates that line the cornice of the Detroit News. I was familiar with two of the four, Gutenberg, the inventor of the printing press, and Ben Franklin. Say hi the next time you drive by on West Lafayette. And this is the original lobby of the Detroit News per Albert Kahn's design. When I worked in this building, there were drop ceilings in this lobby. You had no idea there was groin vaulting up above. To its credit, Bedrock, the development corporation of Dan Gilbert of Quicken Loans fame, has restored the lobby to its original glory, and it's really worth walking through if you're anywhere near West Lafayette and 2nd or 3rd. And he designed the Detroit Free Press building, which I think is a wonderful 1920s Art Deco building. Again, vertical, vertical, vertical. As well as a series of lookalike bank branches for the Detroit Savings Bank, which I just think are marvelous, almost Egyptian-inspired buildings. You find them scattered all over the city. A number have been turned into Pentecostal churches. All right, wrapping up, we have a couple of things to look at before I let you go. One is, how in the world could Albert Kahn, whose father Joseph was a rabbi, how in the world could he continue to work for one of the world's most famous anti-Semites, Henry Ford? And here I have to say, this is all speculation, and I'm very clear in the book that I'm speculating, but I have a couple of theories. The principal one is that Albert Kahn begins working for Henry Ford in 1908. This series in Henry Ford's weekly newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, starts in 1920. And this is really one of the first time the public at large gets a big glimpse of Henry Ford's attitude towards Jews. Beforehand, it had not been so widely known. At this point, Albert Kahn has been working for Ford for 12 years. The two men were not exactly friends, although Albert was very close with Edsel Ford, Henry's son, who ends up running the company. But the two men, Henry and Albert, admired each other. They were both practical geniuses. They were both completely uneducated men. And I think in one another, they saw kindred spirits. And Albert was always very clear that a lot of the innovations at Highland Park and at the Rouge came from Henry Ford and not necessarily from the architect. Kahn's family says that he was deeply hurt by this series, which appeared weekly in the Dearborn Independent for about a year and a half or so, until a boycott of Ford products by the Jewish community ended up putting a stop to it. Henry Ford understood economics if he didn't understand the morality of racism. Bill Ford, who was a nephew who worked in the firm when his uncle was still alive, said that after this started appearing in 1920, that Albert Kahn never set foot on the Rouge property again, that he always delegated one of his brothers who worked in the firm, and there were several of them. Felix worked there for a while, Julius for a while, before he went out on his own with the Trust Concrete Company and became a huge success on his own. Also, Moritz, who was, I believe, the third sibling, worked most of his career with Kahn Associates. And Felix, did I mention Felix? He works there briefly. The other issue with the Dearborn Independent and breaking with Henry Ford is, had Albert Kahn broken with Henry Ford, word would have gotten out. It would have been a huge scandal. It would have been an international scandal. Kahn did factories for most of the major auto builders, although he built almost everything or designed almost everything for Ford up until his death in 42. There was no way to keep this from being just a tremendous embarrassment and scandal. And I think Kahn was very averse to that. And by 1920, he had almost 100 people working for him. So he had responsibilities. Henry Ford had made him and his extended family wealthy. And beyond that, and I think this may be the most important issue, if you grew up in Western and Central Europe in the 1870s and early 1880s, and then moved to provincial Detroit in 1881, and it was provincial in 1881, if you were a Jewish businessman aiming to go far, I think you had to regard anti-Semitism just like bouts of really lousy weather. It was kind of a given that you were going to bump into it occasionally. And if you let it defeat you, you were never going to get anywhere. And so I think Kahn, like so many Jewish people of his generation, just gritted their teeth and slogged on and tried to shrug it off. In any event, that's my theory. Kahn, by the way, never said anything on the subject that's in the printed record, except once in Malcolm Bingay's Detroit is My Own Hometown, an autobiography. He quotes Albert Kahn as saying that he knew that Mr. Ford, quote, at one time, end quote, had had a prejudice against my people. All right, finally, how does Albert Kahn save the Western world from the scourge of Hitlerism? I will tell you, in 1929, the Soviet Union, which at the time was the most backward of all the major and minor powers in Europe, a completely agrarian society with virtually no industry, they sent a team to the United States to snoop around for the best industrial architect they could find. And they picked Albert Kahn, who's on the left signing with his Soviet counterpart, Saul Braun, on the right. By the way, the dapper gentleman with the cigar behind him is Moritz Kahn, Kahn's brother, who ends up, well, let me put it this way. Albert Kahn gets hired first to design a tractor plant for Stalingrad, which is one of the largest plants on planet Earth. He does such a good job at that he is then in short order hired to be the chief consulting architect for the first 5-year plan of the Soviet Union. The 5-year plans, there were 2 of them, and they were the Soviet Union's blitzkrieg effort in the late 20s and 30s to industrialize as quickly as humanly possible, to catch up with the West, and then increasingly also because I think a number of Soviets, not Stalin, but a number of Soviets recognized that Hitler was going to become a problem for the Soviet Union. Albert Kahn Associates opens up an office in Moscow in late 1929. Moritz goes over, Albert stays in Detroit. 25 members of Albert Kahn Associates go over. In a couple of years, they design 500 factories, give or take, virtually every one of which was built, including the Stalingrad tractor factory and the Chelyabinsk tractor factory, which again was one of the largest industrial conurbations on planet Earth. Here's the important thing. At a stroke, Albert Kahn Associates industrializes the Soviet Union. Now, Albert Kahn gets out in 1932 or 33 when the Soviets run out of hard currency and can no longer pay in gold or dollars. And they offered very generously to pay in rubles, which were worthless outside of the Soviet Union. So the Kahn firm very graciously, no hard feelings, pulled out. But as I say, almost all of those design factories get built. And by the time that Hitler invades in 1940-41, virtually all of the Kahn factories get converted to war production. You take away Albert Kahn and the Soviet Union can't produce the goods it needs to defend itself against the Nazi onslaught. And the bottom line is nobody expected the Soviet Union to stand up and survive a Nazi attack, but they do. And I submit quite humbly that much of that credit goes to Albert Kahn and the factories that industrialized the Soviet Union, for which I will add, he has never really gotten any credit, although there is now, in part because of Claire Zimmerman at the University of Michigan and people at Lawrence Tech, University in Southfield, Michigan, who've gotten really interested in Kahn's contribution to architecture generally. There's now increasing research into this area. But if you ask most Russian architects, I think I can promise you they never would have heard of Albert Kahn's contributions to their country's survival. And that, believe it or not, is it. We are out of here. I am ready to take questions if I haven't bored you to tears already. And thank you all very much.
Well, Michael, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I found it fascinating and really delightful to have you with us tonight. So we had a bunch of questions at the beginning where people were mentioning buildings in their town, auto factories in Chicago. I think there was a newspaper building in Providence, Rhode Island. How could people find out if the building is by Albert Kahn?
Well, for anything in Detroit, you could go to the authoritative website, 400 Buildings by Albert Kahn in Detroit, which is on the ilovedetroit.com website, if memory serves. But Google 400 Buildings in Detroit by Albert Kahn, and you will pull it up. But that's limited to Detroit and Michigan buildings. So it's a little bit more challenging to track down the authorship of buildings outside of Michigan. You can pretty much be certain that any Ford plants built before the early 1940s were probably Kahn firm designs. And that goes for an awful lot of other car factories, from General Motors, Studebaker, Hudson, you name it, scattered around the country. I don't know if the Providence Journal building, which I'm assuming is what they're referring to, is a Kahn design. I would be delighted to discover it was. I do know that the Brooklyn office of the New York Times was a Kahn design from the 20s or 30s. I don't know whether or not it still stands. By the way, we talked earlier about the Chrysler half-ton truck plant, that industrial cathedral that's so crisp that has been added on to. There's said to be a look-alike factory south of Chicago that I never investigated, but it may or may not be there. There are two important works on Albert Kahn that you could consult if you wanted to. One is Designing for Industry by Grant Hildebrand, and the other is Albert Kahn, Architect of Ford, by Federico Bucci, who interestingly, BUCCI, is the Dean of Architecture at Milan Polytechnic, to give you some sense of the international interest in Albert Kahn.
Okay, very good. Janet Krieger is asking about the role of Wirt Rowland, who is best known in Detroit for designing the Guardian Building and other golden era skyscrapers downtown in the financial district in Detroit. Did that at Smith Hinchman Grills, but worked for Kahn for a number of years. So can you talk about his influence and his role within the company?
I'm not nearly as well versed on Wirt Rowland's work at Kahn as Michael Smith is, who I believe is going to speak about that.
Our next speaker, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding, however, is that Wirt Rowland was involved, please don't correct me right now, Michael, in the design of the General Motors building. My understanding is that Rowland rebelled a little bit against what I think he regarded as Kahn's kind of plotting neoclassicism, and eventually leaves the firm. I actually think he may have been with the Kahn firm on two different occasions, but Rowland is a good example of a parade of Detroit area architects who end up being very important, who first went through Albert Kahn Associates, including our great theater architect, C. Howard Crane. I read at the Smithsonian, I read his condolence note to Ernestine Kahn after Albert's death in 42, in which he noted that the only way he was able to get his job at Albert Kahn Associates was by lying about his age. But that's about all I know about Rowland.
Okay. We have a question. Are there tours of Albert Kahn's work in Detroit? And the answer is, I'll give you a qualified yes on that. The foundation, the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation, is organizing both a bike tour that will take place tentatively in September and walking tours of Albert Kahn's work. So there's a number of architectural tour companies in the city, and some of them will mention Albert's work as maybe as part of a general tour. But watch the website, albertkahnlegacy.org, where we'll be listing calendar events for walking tours and the bike tour about Albert's work. We also have a question. Did he do other stuff in other Eastern European countries besides Russia, the Soviet Union?
Not that I'm aware of. He built some Ford factories in Britain, and it might be that there are some on the continent. I've only seen references to those, but I'm not aware that he ended up doing any large projects in Eastern or Central Europe apart from the factories in the Soviet Union.
Okay. Here's a really question from Janet, who says, how helpful to Kahn's career was his wife's social standing and the connections of her family?
So Ernestine Kahn's maiden name was Krolik, K-R-O-L-I-K. And her father, as I understand it, was a successful, I think the Kroliks had a department store or were involved in that business. She was certainly, she certainly came from a higher social class than Albert did, at least initially. And also, Ernestine was much better educated in formal terms. She graduated from the University of Michigan in the early 1890s, and although she was not in by any means the first class, she was still in one of the early classes where you could count the number of women on a few hands. So I think that you could make the argument. I don't know about her social connections per se, though I do know that the Kahns were married in her parents' house and that it sounded rather grand in the Detroit Free Press description of the ceremony. But I think you can probably make some assumption that the social connections there were very useful. I've always thought it was interesting that she and her parents were able to see past Kahn's complete lack of a college degree and lack of a formal education. And I think that that says a great deal in particular about Ernestine, who, as I say, was a woman of considerable backbone. I read some of her letters to her father when she was 15 and staying with family members, other Kroliks in St. Paul, Minnesota. And she had a couple of fairly tart observations she made to her father, who clearly had the sort of relationship with her where he would allow that graciously. So I've always liked Ernestine a great deal.
Good. Stephen asks that Kahn should receive more recognition for his innovations in the process of architecture. In particular, he linked architects more closely with engineers and contractors to greatly speed up the entire process. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, yes, and yes. Albert Kahn Associates is one of the first firms, I'm not sure it was the only or the first firm, but to bring engineers and other building professionals into the firm so that you had sort of everyone under one roof. And he did institute systems and whatnot that were revolutionary. For instance, the way that Albert Kahn Associates tracked the progress of a given construction project mirrored in remarkable ways the system that Henry Ford used to track the progress on various building projects and automotive development projects. And there's some suggestion that Kahn basically borrowed that system. This is another point where Claire Zimmerman at the University of Michigan is really well versed in these sorts of systems advances that the Kahn firm was able to institute and that then become widespread through the industry generally. I will also say that some people in the industry, tongue in cheek, blame Albert Kahn for inventing the corporate architecture office, which sometimes comes in for a little insult and abuse. There are others who also, given his work in the Soviet Union, the fact that virtually all of his auto factories in the United States converted to war production, and the fact that he built naval and air bases all over the Pacific theater for the US Armed Forces in World War II, a number of people connect him, I think a little unfairly, with the creation of the military-industrial complex.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Maria is asking about Corrado Parducci, the famous architectural sculptor. And she said many sculptures in Albert Kahn's buildings she thinks are Parducci's. Is this true? Did they work together?
Yes, it is true. And the authority to consult on that would be the book by Dale Carlson, who created the 400 buildings by Albert Kahn and Metro Detroit website, and also recently put out a guide to Corrado Parducci designs in Detroit, many of which went into Albert Kahn buildings and are it's a resource that's well worth consulting if you're interested. There's also, by the way, a Corrado Parducci Foundation in Detroit, and they have a website which also has a lot of information. Interestingly, I read an oral history that was recorded and is at the Smithsonian with Parducci that he did in the, I don't know, I guess the 30s or 40s. Some people have argued that Albert Kahn was not much involved with the design of many of his later buildings. At its high watermark, his firm might have had as many as 600 people on its payroll. The argument is that Albert Kahn was a distant figure, not much involved. Parducci said that simply was not the case, that Albert Kahn was very interested in specifics of what Parducci was going to design on his buildings.
Okay, a couple of quick ones here from Levi. Was Kahn charitable? And from Barb, what languages did Kahn speak?
Let me do languages first. He spoke German clearly. He spoke English. I don't know. My guess would be he would have had to have spoken some Yiddish. It seems unlikely that his parents wouldn't have spoken Yiddish, but I don't know that for a fact. I do not believe that he spoke other languages, though, because he didn't have the time or the educational opportunity to learn them. As for being charitable, yeah, he was, and I'm glad the question came up. Among other things, the Detroit Institute of Arts is constituted in 1918. The building that we know as the DIA is not open until 1927, but Kahn signs on in 1918 as a City of Detroit Arts Commissioner. For those of you not from Detroit, the Detroit Institute of Arts are surprisingly magnificent, if relatively small by comparison to New York or Boston Encyclopedic Art Museum. It's formed in 1918 as a city department. It was owned by the city of Detroit, and a group of very distinguished, successful, wealthy white men, this being the 19 teens, were appointed arts commissioners to oversee the DIA. Albert Kahn signed on and served until his death in 42, and also played a significant role in bringing, or at least a role in bringing Diego Rivera to Detroit, since he had to vote on that and approve it along with the other commissioners. Albert Kahn was also, even though he was not very religious, he was what we might call a cultural Jew, but not a religious Jew, which I think had a little bit of rebellion against his father, the rabbi, in it, perhaps. But Albert was for years on the board of Temple Bethel, and for many years was the chairman of the choir committee, which I've always thought was kind of adorable.
Pam O'Connor in Kalamazoo is asking about Kahn's Upjohn office building. She's trying to get it on the National Register, and she notes that it's attached to the new research and production facility. And she asks, how many of these office manufacturing complexes did he and his firm design? And I'm sure the number must be enormous.
Yeah, he designs factory and office complexes for an awful lot of his factories. Very often the administration building would be in sort of Art Deco or Art Moderne style, especially in the 30s. Yeah, I don't know the number, but it would be hundreds at least.
Ernestine is asking, did Albert ever study music? Now, I know his daughter, Rosalie Butzel, told me he loved classical music.
Yes.
But did he ever study music?
Yes, and in fact, he loved classical music so much that he, despite the fact that he worked most weekends, on Saturdays, I believe, he always made a point of coming home at lunchtime to sit with Ernestine and listen to the Metropolitan Opera on the radio, and that he really kept to that. He studied piano when he was a child in Luxembourg. The Kahn's fiscal circumstances were a little kinder in Luxembourg before their move to Detroit. So he was able to go to elementary school and take piano lessons. And at age 7 or 8, he was apparently so gifted at the piano that his astonished family began to regard him as a prodigy. But once in the United States, he doesn't keep the piano up. And I believe it's Rosalie who was interviewed about this by Grant Hildebrand, the author of Designing for Industry, one of the great biographies on Albert Kahn. And she said that it was her understanding that her father could only do one of his passions completely. It had to be piano or architecture, and he chose architecture. So to my knowledge, he didn't play piano much as an adult.
And maybe you can confirm the other thing I've heard, which is that he was colorblind, which is why he became an architect. He wanted to be an artist, but he became an architect because he couldn't see color.
Yeah, and that's true. He had been given drawing lessons by Julius Melchers, who was an artist whose son Gary Melchers is much more famous and has work at the DIA. But Julius Melchers discovered at some point that Albert was colorblind, and apparently advised him against fine art as a career, which the young Albert had been fantasizing about. It still is a bit nip and tuck, though, when Albert interviews at Mason and Rice, and there's some suggestion that it was Julius Melchers who got him that opportunity after the John L. Scott people kicked Albert out of their office. And he was given, at least I've read in one place, a color test, since color does figure in architecture, and that he had to guess. He just winged it, as it were, and succeeded. I've wondered sometimes whether or not his color blindness has something to do with the dull color palette of a lot of his buildings, which tend to either be gray or dark red, but who knows?
Yeah. And okay, and Lydia asks, what was his relationship, if any, with Frank Lloyd Wright?
They knew each other, and there is a story which may or may not be apocryphal that on visiting Albert Kahn's office at some point in the teens or 20s, that Wright leaned back and with some amusement said something about, well, the two most important architects on planet Earth in the same room together. They do not seem to have necessarily been buddies, but they certainly knew and I presume respected one another. Interestingly enough, in the early 1890s, Frank Lloyd Wright either leaves in Chicago, he worked for Louis Sullivan at Root and Sullivan, I believe is the name of the firm. Mm-hmm. And he either leaves Louis Sullivan's employ and Elihu Root's employ voluntarily of his own accord, or he gets fired, which I think actually may be the truer interpretation. So they were looking for a replacement architect, and one of the young rising architects they looked at was Albert Kahn in Detroit. And he was much tempted, but did not take the offer because he had his entire family of 9 people dependent on him. Albert, by the way, going back
Mm.
to his charity, he put most, perhaps all of his siblings through the University of Michigan, or at least substantially helped them in that.
Wow. Just one more note on his artistic endeavors. He was a marvelous freehand sketcher. If you see some of his, I mean, his sketches of cathedrals in Europe are in museums, including at U of M. It was just wonderful, the ability to do that just freehand.
Yeah, and I guess we can credit Julius Melchers for that.
Okay. And I know you're going to appreciate this one, Mike. Maria Gonzalez writes, "Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation. In fact, I just bought the book on Amazon and I'm getting it on Friday. So woohoo."
Shamelessly, I'm delighted. Thank you very much.
Right.
I'll check my
Right.
Amazon ranking when I get off.
Right. Well, speaking of, you can buy your books, like mine, if I can say that, at local bookstores. Order them through local independent bookstores, and through Amazon and Wayne State University Press for your book, your
Yeah.
2 books. So with that, I think we're about at the end of time today. We really want to thank our audience for hanging in there and all the great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to everybody, but we got to a lot of them. And thank you to the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation for sponsoring this event tonight. And Michael Hodges, thank you so much. It was a delightful lecture, delightful hour and a half. I really enjoyed it thoroughly, and I'm sure everybody else did too. So
Likewise, thanks so much, everyone.
you bet, everybody. Folks, enjoy the rest of the evening. Remember, June 2nd, Michael G. Smith will be here to lecture on Albert and Julius and the invention of the modern factory. And we hope you see all back here for that. You can go to the albertkahnlegacy.org website to register for that event. Okay, with that, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening, folks. Bye-bye.